The longer you're single, the more deeply you begin to see, not just others, but the patterns beneath them, the smirks that don't reach the eyes, the compliments that float, weightless, without origin. The stories people tell you that are really stories they tell themselves, hoping you'll nod and believe. Solitude does something no relationship ever truly can. It tunes your inner ear to the off-key hum of inauthenticity. What once passed for charisma now strikes as performance. What once sounded like passion now echoes like rehearsed desperation. Time alone doesn't simply heal or harden. It hones, it sharpens the senses most people dull for comfort. When you're unaccompanied long enough, you develop a kind of emotional night vision. You see what's whispered beneath what's said. You begin to notice how often affection is confused with possession, how attraction is too often a hunger disguised as admiration. And you start to resist, not because you're cold, but because you've grown precise. You no longer fall for the spectacle of connection. You observe its scaffolding, its fragility, its motives. This clarity is not always a gift. Often it becomes a quiet curse. Where others see possibilities, you see red flags painted white. Where others surrender, you analyze. You pass tone, examine intent, study inconsistencies, not to be cruel, but because your solitude has made your attention sacred. It's not that you've become cynical, only careful, and care, in a world addicted to speed, is mistaken for resistance. They think you're closed off, but really you're just awake. Those who live tethered to others never face the weight of their own gaze. But in solitude, there's nowhere to hide. You become familiar with the slow machinery of your own thoughts, your reflexive fears, your yearning for meaning that doesn't collapse under scrutiny. And once you've survived that exposure, that nakedness to the self, it becomes far more difficult to be impressed by surface, level symmetry, or temporary warmth. You're no longer dazzled by charm because you understand it as a tool, a soft glove that sometimes conceals a closed fist. So when someone new enters your orbit, their words must pass through layers of discernment that weren't there before. Their gestures are weighed against a silence you've come to revere. You don't need anyone to complete you, because you've spent enough time alone to see the illusion in that phrase. Completion doesn't come from another. It comes from making peace with the unfilled spaces within yourself. And peace, once earned, is not easily traded away. There is a cost to this clarity. It can be lonely. You may watch others fall quickly, love easily, trust without question. And yet you remain still, not because you're afraid, but because you finally understand what it means to be truly seen, and how rare that is. You're not looking for someone who shines. You're looking for someone whose shadow doesn't frighten you. Someone whose presence doesn't try to distract you from yourself, but allows you to remain exactly as you are, quiet, watchful, whole. In the end, it's not that you're hard to impress, it's that you've learned to stop mistaking noise for depth. Over time, solitude becomes a kind of architecture. Quietly, brick by brick, you begin constructing an internal world, one not shaped by external expectations, but by private rituals, unspoken values, and the symmetry of your own logic. There is precision in the way you build it, not out of arrogance, but necessity. When no one is beside you to blur your edges, you become defined. You know which hours of the day you prefer to be silent. You learn what truly nourishes your spirit and what merely distracts it. Preferences, once vague, calcify into principles. What was once improvisation becomes design. This internal construction isn't immediately visible to others. They meet you and think you're just particular or complicated. But what they're actually encountering is the resistance of a fortress. Not a fortress to keep love out, but one that demands that love be real enough to enter. You're not cold, you're curated. You don't reject connection, but you require it to arrive with reverence. And that's something most people aren't taught to offer. They bring chaos disguised as passion. They knock on your door with assumptions, as though your solitude was simply a pause and not a decision. The longer you spend alone, the more intricate your internal structure becomes. There's an order to it, a rhythm, and that rhythm is not easily disrupted. What others call compromise, you often experience as intrusion, not because you're selfish, but because you know the cost of restructuring your world for someone who may not stay. You've done it before, early on, when you still believed in the novelty of being chosen. And you remember how much it dismantled you, how quickly the scaffolding of your selfhood collapsed under the weight of someone else's expectations. You swore, perhaps silently, never to allow that demolition again. What this means is that anyone who wishes to enter must first be willing to understand the space as it is, not as they wish it to be. They must walk carefully, observe, ask, and most won't. Most will rush to fill your silence with noise, your stillness with urgency, your rituals with improvisation. They will try to repaint the walls before they've even asked what the colors mean to you. That is why you do not open so easily, because you know now, whatever enters will leave fingerprints, and some things, once smudged, never feel clean again. But there is beauty in this clarity. The internal world you've built isn't just protection. It's a masterpiece. It reflects years of choosing yourself when there was no applause for doing so. It holds the exact texture of your resilience, the fine lines of your discernment, the unmistakable signature of someone who has survived not being understood, and came to understand themselves instead. That is not something you give away. That is something you share, carefully, with someone who speaks the same quiet dialect of truth. In the end, you don't need someone to build with you. You need someone who doesn't try to tear it all down. The mind does something strange in the absence of intimacy. It begins to idealize what it cannot touch. Slowly, quietly, it sketches a silhouette of love so refined, so untouched by flaw or noise, that no living person could possibly inhabit it. The longer you're single, the more vivid this illusion becomes, not out of delusion, but out of longing, a longing that has nowhere to land, so it grows in abstraction, evolving from a desire to be known into an impossible expectation to be completed. This is the danger of too much solitude, not that you forget how to love, but that you begin loving only what cannot disappoint you. You romanticize the perfect response, the unspoken understanding, the glance that arrives exactly when it's needed. You come to crave a version of connection that's so curated, so surgically constructed within your imagination, that when reality finally knocks it feels clumsy. People speak too slowly, miss your meaning, blink at the wrong moment. They disrupt the choreography. They ruin the narrative. You didn't mean for it to happen. You didn't mean to sculpt someone in your mind and then hold others up to its impossible shape. But the longer you wait, the more the sculpture hardens. You add details, you assign depth, you build backstories for the kind of person who will finally understand you. And without realizing it, you begin measuring every potential partner against a phantom. A ghost, one who never forgets your silence, one who speaks in synchrony with your private rhythm, one who always sees you. But people in the real world are messy. They interrupt, they misunderstand, they contradict. And when you've lived too long in the clean corridors of your own fantasy, this mess feels offensive. Their affection feels heavy. Their love feels insufficient, not because it is, but because it doesn't match the orchestration you've rehearsed endlessly in your mind. So you pull back, not because you're unwilling to love, but because you're unable to accept anything that doesn't already fit your script. This is the paradox. Your standards rise in proportion to your loneliness. You want deeper, more honest, more expansive connection, but you've made the entry requirements so precise, so impossibly niche, that almost no one qualifies. You mistake compatibility for perfection. You forget that real love isn't elegant, it's flawed, it stutters, it shows up late, spills coffee, says the wrong thing, but stays anyway. And when you've spent years alone with only your ideals to answer to, this kind of love feels too chaotic to be trusted. Still, the fantasy remains tempting. It asks nothing of you. It never hurts. It never leaves. But it also never arrives, and that's the quiet tragedy. You fall in love with the idea of someone so fully that you lose the capacity to truly meet anyone at all. So perhaps the real courage now isn't in waiting for the ideal, but in allowing something real to walk through the door, flawed and breathing, and choosing to let it stay. There comes a point when the silence no longer feels empty. It feels earned. It becomes a kind of sanctuary, a personal cathedral where the noise of the world cannot follow you in. In the beginning, solitude is a shock, a vacuum that presses against your chest and whispers all the things you've been avoiding. But with time you acclimate, the silence stops accusing you and starts teaching you, and eventually it becomes something you protect, not because you fear the outside, but because the outside rarely respects the quiet you had to bleed for. When you've lived long enough in this kind of stillness, most conversations begin to sound like static. They arrive overloaded with filler, with performance, with the unspoken desperation to be liked or validated. You begin to recognize how rarely people speak to reveal themselves. They speak to be seen a certain way. And you, who have spent countless nights excavating your own mind in the dark, cannot pretend not to notice. It's not snobbery, it's fatigue. You've heard too much meaningless talk. You've wasted too many hours untangling words that had no weight behind them. So now, when someone enters your life, they are not merely competing with loneliness. They are competing with the peace that came after it, and peace, real peace, the kind that hums beneath your skin and teaches you how to breathe, is not easily replaced. You begin to measure everything against it. The late night calls, the sudden laughter, the conversations that don't quite land. You ask yourself, is this better than the silence I've made a home in? And more often than not, the answer is no. This is what people don't understand. They think the long-term single are bitter or broken or waiting for a savior. But really, what they've done is far more dangerous to the shallow world around them. They've adapted. They've stopped searching and started settling into themselves. They've made their solitude not a punishment, but a preference. And once that happens, the bar for connection rises beyond charm or chemistry. Now, it's about whether someone can enter your silence and not shatter it. Whether they can sit with you in a room, speak nothing, and still be understood. And here's the cruel irony. Most people fear silence. They mistake it for disinterest or awkwardness or judgment. They try to fill it. They throw stories into it, jokes, compliments, confessions, anything to avoid the weight of simply being present. But you've lived in that weight. You've grown strong under it, and now you can spot with terrifying ease those who cannot stand still, those who need constant distraction, those who want to be heard but have no intention of listening. So when you seem unimpressed or distant or hard to engage, it's not because you're unwilling. It's because you've cultivated a silence that's more nourishing than the noise most people bring. You've built a life that doesn't beg to be interrupted. And maybe the greatest love now isn't loud at all. It's the one quiet enough to let your peace remain intact. There's a strange transformation that takes place when you've been alone long enough. Not just physically, but emotionally, psychologically. You begin to see your loneliness not as a problem to be solved, but as a condition to be studied. At first, it gnaws at you, pulls at your sense of worth, makes you wonder if you've been forgotten or are simply unlovable. But over time, you learn to sit with it, to listen, and eventually you begin to understand it. You begin to recognize it as something far more complex than emptiness. It becomes a mirror, a teacher, a presence. And once you've made peace with that presence, attempts to distract you from it begin to feel almost disrespectful. You no longer fall for grand entrances or flashy affection. You don't melt when someone finally notices you. That's not enough, not anymore. Because you've looked directly at the thing most people spend their entire lives avoiding, the void. that strange, quiet ache that lives just beneath the noise of daily life. You didn't run from it, you made space for it, you examined it, and now it doesn't frighten you, which is precisely why most people do. You see, people are used to love as a kind of mutual escape. They want to be distracted from themselves and offer distraction in return. They believe that connection is about softening the edges, soothing the tension, covering the cracks. But you've learned that real intimacy demands the opposite. It requires exposure, a willingness to bring your damage, your doubts, your unfiltered self, and lay it bare. Not to be fixed, but to be seen. So when someone approaches you with charm or attraction, with rehearsed words or fragile flattery, you don't melt, you observe. You measure their willingness to be uncomfortable. You listen for the silences they try to skip over. You look at how they sit with their own discomfort, because you've already sat with yours, and that changes the game entirely. You can no longer be wooed by temporary comfort. You need truth, and truth often arrives awkwardly. It stumbles, it doesn't always flatter you, but it's real, and it stays. And staying matters more to you now than impressing. This is what solitude teaches that no relationship ever quite can. It strips away your appetite for illusion. You've seen too much of yourself to be fooled by appearances. You know the difference between attention and presence, between lust and care, between being wanted and being understood. And unless what's offered confronts the very same depth you've already had to face in yourself, you let it pass. You have to. Because once you've survived the full weight of your own loneliness, you come to realize it's not the absence of people that hurts. It's the presence of the wrong ones, promising connection they can't sustain, pretending to understand what they fear to touch. And so now you don't chase comfort, you wait for courage, the kind of courage that doesn't try to save you from your loneliness, but walks with you through it, quietly, willingly, and without fear. Eventually, you come to understand that every relationship is a negotiation, spoken or not. The early ones often begin in blindness, in a haze of wanting to be seen or loved, and so you concede. Small things at first. You laugh when something isn't funny. You pretend the silence between you isn't uncomfortable. You mold your shape ever so slightly to fit theirs, but you learn. You learn that compromise is rarely mutual when it comes from fear of being alone. It becomes a slow erosion. And you wake up one day in a life you barely recognize, whispering apologies to a version of yourself you abandoned just to keep someone else from walking away. Time alone sharpens your memory of those compromises. It reminds you of all the quiet ways you betrayed yourself, and for what? Company, validation, the illusion of being chosen. It's not bitterness that sets in. It's clarity. You begin to realize that staying alone costs far less than becoming someone else to earn affection. And when you understand the real weight of compromise, you stop giving yourself away so cheaply. Now, the idea of bending, even slightly, for someone who doesn't understand your depth feels unthinkable. Not out of arrogance, but out of reverence. You've rebuilt yourself too many times. You've patched the holes, restructured the frame, sealed the fractures left behind by others who promised permanence and brought only confusion. You're not unwilling to compromise, but the terms have changed. Now you ask, will this cost me the parts of myself I fought hardest to protect? And if the answer is yes, you walk. This is the mistake people make when they meet someone who's been alone for a long time. They think independence means inflexibility, that strong boundaries mean emotional distance, but in truth it's about value, not just self-worth, but existential value, the kind that comes from knowing you've been to the bottom of yourself and learned to live there. You don't fear emptiness anymore, you've eaten with it, slept beside it, woken up and built something within it. So if someone comes and asks you to rearrange all of that just to feel less alone, you hesitate. Because you know what you'd be giving up, and they usually don't. You've seen the quiet grief of self-abandonment, you've lived through it, and once you've escaped it, Even peace that feels solitary is better than affection that demands your disappearance. That's what most people miss, that the longer you're single, the more sacred your internal world becomes, and anyone who wants to be a part of it must approach like a guest, not a bulldozer. So now you don't ask, will they choose me? You ask, will they protect what I've built? And if they can't, if their love arrives with demolition tools, you do what once seemed impossible. You let them leave, not because you're cold, but because finally you've learned that compromising your peace is the most expensive decision you could ever make. And some of us are done paying for the privilege of being misunderstood.